Hi there, everybody. It's Rabbi Leah. How are you? I hope you're doing well. I hope you are remembering to wash your hands, to wear your masks, to sit 6 feet apart, and to have your mask on anytime you're around other people, even if they're not right close to you. So, enough of that. All right. So, this morning I'm going to continue what we had started last week, which is a look at the various streams, denominations, movements within Judaism. And for those of you who have joined me for the first couple of lessons, you know by now that it's not as easy as saying, I'm Reform, I'm conservative, or something like that. And today you're going to see how the various branches begin to take shape over history. So let's do a really quick review because those of you who've been with me since the beginning already have this information. This is the chart that I am using. The print is obviously really, really, really tiny, but just so that we review, we start with biblical Judaism, which is considered during the period of 1300 BCE up to 600 BCE. We saw the Israel divided into two kingdoms. Um, Ancient Palestine divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judea in the south. And we talked a bit about the Samaritans, who they are, whether or not they still exist. And in fact, there are still about 800 Samaritans living predominantly in Israel, in the West Bank area, and Nablus. And they consider Mount Gerizim to be the holy mountain where the temple was built. We talked about Second Temple Judaism, which went from 600 before the Common Era up until the year 70 of the Common Era, at which point in time there was a devastating historical event in the life of Jewish history, which was the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Second Temple Judaism that was around for 600 years, a little bit more than that, gave rise to the Pharisees, who were the precursor, so to speak, or the predecessor to to Rabbinic Judaism. The Sadducees, who were the elites. They were like the upper crust, and they were the priestly cult, many of whom were came from the Hasmonean dynasty. And then we talked about the Essenes, who were this sect who went off to live in the Judean desert, lived this very, very Spartan type lifestyle. Many of them were celibate. Um, they didn't drink, they didn't cut their hair. It sounds very much like the Nazarites, the kind of vow that they took. And then we left off with the Zealots. I didn't talk to you about the Zealots yet, and I'd like to talk to you about the Zealots because they were quite an interesting group of people. They were, uh, as the name implies, zealots. And so, how did these zealots come into being? Well, they lived in Jerusalem from the first century of the before the Common Era through Second Temple Judaism, and they were considered to have their own sect, their own kind of Jewish philosophy. They were very aggressive. They were also known as the Sicarii, uh, where they would uh, take knives out of their clothing, long daggers, and stab people. And so you didn't want to get on the bad side of a zealot. They staged a rebellion because in the 6th century, the governor in Jerusalem, who was part of the Roman Empire, um, declared a tax, a census tax, which meant that every person living in the city of Jerusalem and that part of Israel had to pay a tax, and they rebelled against this. Um, the Talmud calls them by the words Biryonim, which means the wild ones, or boorish. So maybe they were the Antifa of their day. Who knows? I don't know a lot about Antifa except, what you hear, which is they have some very radical and zealous kinds of tactics. So these struggles were taking place, lots of internal struggles in Israel at the time, between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as well as the early Christians who were coming into greater numbers. The Essenes and the Zealots, the Essenes were much more mild mannered and peaceful. Um, the Pharisees, who wanted to maintain the authority, and they wanted to keep the classical teachings of the Torah. The Sadducees, who really wanted to have more political influence, and so on. Okay, what does this have to do with Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, modern Orthodoxy, Chabad, and all the rest? We're getting there. So today we're actually going to move a little closer to that. Okay, so most streams of modern Judaism today developed from the Pharisaic movement. So we actually have to go back to first century Judaism to understand how it is that we all kind of came into being. And I'm going to show you where the Pharisees are on this chart. They were, as I said, in Second Temple, 600 to 70 BCE, and they developed right here. So you can see how early on they are. These are the modern day movements, and they were very early on, but the line of descendancy comes directly from the Pharisees. And as I said, most streams of Judaism today developed from this Pharisaic movement, which became known as Rabbinic Judaism, or Yahadut Rabbanit. And this form of Judaism, it's not a stream, it's a actual form of Judaism, came shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was in 132 of the Common Era. And this was the final revolt against the Romans. Sadly, the Israelites were soundly defeated, and the final takeover of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple was complete. Um, Other movements disappeared, like the Sadducees, from the historical records, even though it's said that the Sadducees probably they kept on existing, probably in some kind of non-organized form, for at least several more decades. Um, they have been referred to, we think, in the Talmud by a couple different names. The Baalei Mikra, which means a Baal is a lord, or a lord of Mikra, which is the Mikra is the Torah, and they were also known as the Karaim. And so essentially, the Sadducees um, disappeared. I don't think any of us have met someone who would tell you that they are a descendant of the Sadducees. Those of us living today who are Jews are descendants of the Pharisaic tradition, which became Rabbinic Judaism, and that was a type of Judaism that believed in the oral Torah, the Mishnah, and so on and so forth. Okay, although the Mishnah came later, but believed that there were two different Torahs. There was both of which were given on Sinai. One was the written Torah that God physically gave to Moses, and the other was the oral Torah, which God also gave to Moses, which was not written down, but was seen as divine nonetheless. Okay, so that takes us to Rabbinic Judaism, of which you and I are a part. Now, you may ask, is there anything other than Rabbinic Judaism? And the answer would be yes, because there is a tradition that survives known as Karaite Judaism. Um, and that started in the early 19th century. There were non-rabbinic sages who didn't follow in the traditions of the rabbis, and their followers rejected this oral law. They said the Torah, the written law, is the only law. We're not giving any credence to any of this thing called the oral law. That the Tanakh, the Bible, was divinely inspired, and not recognizing at all the authority of the rabbis. So, obviously the rabbis are responsible for works like the Midrash, the Talmud, the Mishnah, and so on. And so the Karaites don't give any credence to those writings, strictly what is in the Hebrew Bible. So it's interesting to see the difference. And you ask, are there still Karaites living today? Do Karaites still exist today? And the answer to that is yes, they do. There's a community in Israel estimated at more than 30,000 people. It's concentrated around the cities of Ashdod and Ramla, and you've probably heard those names before. There are some small communities that exist outside of Israel, and many of those individuals reside in Eastern Europe, and they consider themselves ethnically distinct from other Karaite Jews. So, there's a handful of Karaite Jews left, but they got to have different groups, those who are in Eastern Europe and those who are in Israel. We're always forming these different groups, regardless of how few of us there are. So, a couple of interesting things about the Karaites and where the word comes from. The word comes from kara. Kara is a, or likro, is a Hebrew word which means to read. And so they see themselves as those who adhere to the original Torah, the reading as it exists, and they consider anything that came after that, in terms of rabbinic writings, to be inauthentic and not from the Word of God. So they're purists as far as Torah Judaism is concerned, and don't practice any of the rituals or observances that Rabbinic Judaism has given us, which are many, including kashrut, at least the kind of kashrut that we practice today, which is not the same as biblical kashrut. All right, so that's a whole different subject that we could study, but very, very different. Biblical kashrut and rabbinic kashrut, two different worlds, two different worlds. So we had these Karaite Jews, and what happened as a result of the dispersion of Jews after the destruction of the first temple and then the second temple in the year 70 was really what began the history of these ethnic and cultural divisions that took place. Because if you were carried off in one of these destructions of your land, and you were taken to Babylonia, or you were taken to Rome, or you moved anywhere else and out of the land of Israel, you were now part of the diaspora. You were dispersed. There's another word that is also used for those who live outside of Israel. Um, I don't think it's very nice. It's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, politically incorrect. Those who live outside of the land of Israel, and this term is generally used by the ultra Orthodox to describe those of us who don't live in Israel, and we're living in the galut. The galut is exile. So the implication is that because you're not living in Israel, in the land, you can't be authentically Jewish. And so you're living in exile, and that's not really the place you want to be. Ultimately, everybody wants to move back to Israel. May or may not be true for me or for you. But the word diaspora is really the word that's commonly used. So we start to see these ethnic and cultural divisions. I mean, let's face it, if you are now living in Greece or in Rome or in Spain or in Europe, at least what Europe was at that time, or different parts of the world, in order to get along, you're going to have to begin to assimilate. And I think I'll just remind you, when we were studying Pirkei Avot, there were names among the rabbis that were distinctively Hellenistic, Greek names. Antigonus of Socho, for example. Antigonos is not Hebrew, it's definitely Greek. So we know that there was this acculturation that was taking place. And there are, and even among this wide array of communities, there are some things that are common, but many things have developed independently and are highly distinguishable by varying practices in matters that are not considered central ideas to Judaism, such as um, uh, Maimonides' ladder of the Jewish principles of faith. So we're talking more about ethnic and cultural divisions here than we are necessarily divisions regarding Jewish practice. Different languages are developing. The only Jews who are speaking Hebrew are those who are living in the land of Israel. And much later, of course, much later, Ladino, which is a kind of a Yiddish of Spain. It's a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew, and then of course Yiddish in the European countries. So although there are these numerous Jewish ethnic communities, there are several that are large enough to be considered predominant. And if I asked you to name them, you would know what they were. So there are Ashkenazi Jews, there are Sephardic Jews, and there are Mizrahi Jews. Those are three of the predominant, what we would call ethnicities. And those three together constitute about 95% of Jewry. So the Ashkenazi communities are about 75% of the world's Jewish population we're talking about today. And the remaining, and then the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews are about 20%. So, and then the remaining 5% are a group such as Beta Yisrael, which is the group of Ethiopian Jews who follow a different branch of Judaism called the Hemanot. And some of these other tiny branches are nearing extinction because of the amount of assimilation and intermarriage that's taking place into the surrounding non-Jewish cultures and even into the surrounding Jewish cultures. It's, if you're not going to assimilate into the broader culture, maybe you're going to assimilate into a Jewish culture that's not your own. So, when we're looking at these different ethnic and cultural divisions, we're looking at the entire world. We're looking at Europe, which is Ashkenazi and Sephardic, because Sephardic is in Spain and the Ashkenaz is predominantly in uh, Eastern Europe. There are 13 major subgroups under the heading Ashkenazi Judaism, um, including, well, let me go on with this. There are Jews in Southeast and Central Asia, in the Caucasus and in Crimea, North Africa, West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, West Asia. So the ethnic and cultural diversity is enormous. And I would venture to guess that if you went to a Jewish community, a tiny Jewish community in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe there would be some similarities, but it is most likely that you'll look at some of their practices and have no idea what they're doing. And similarly, if they were to worship with us, they would not at all be able to identify what it is that we're doing, or maybe pieces of it, perhaps some Hebrew phrases and so on. Maybe they're wearing a talit or a kippah, but these would have been borrowed customs and not necessarily their own, created in their own communities. So just to give you an idea where we are in our little tiny illegible, almost impossible to read chart, we are along this line right here. And I'm going to read to you what that says. That says Ashkenaz, Spanish, Mizrahi, Italian, and Karaite. Okay, so there was a Babylonian exile, and the Jews who were living in Babylon were actually the descendants of, not the descendants of, the those who came before. What is the opposite of descendant? So something happened in world history around the middle of the 17th century and was evident for about 150 years, and that was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment followed the 30 Years' War, which was a horribly destructive war, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. I'm using my little cheat sheet here, and compelled German writers to pen harsh criticism regarding the ideas of nationalism and warfare. And what began to happen was things became radically reoriented. Uh, it's also called, this time of enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason. And we see that what is beginning to happen is that people were relying on reason, the scientific method, and really three major things: use of reason, scientific method, and progress. And so those who didn't subscribe to this were still living in a kind of a, I don't want to call it backwards, but certainly not a progressive type of a lifestyle. So this Enlightenment had a tremendous impact on Jewish identity and on ideas about the importance and the role of Jewish observance. God existed, but God was not a factor in um, decision making in our world, according to the Enlightenment. And due to the geographical distribution and different entities who were affected by the Enlightenment. This was a philosophical revolution, affected only the Ashkenazi community because the predominant focus of the Enlightenment was amongst the Ashkenaz. And if you look at our little chart here, here are the Ashkenaz, and developing from Ashkenaz is Hasidic movement, 1700 of the Common Era. And that is right around the time of the Enlightenment. So there was this movement towards reason and scientific progress and so on and so forth. And yet there was a movement called Hasidism, which was entrenched in spirituality, God having an impact on our lives day to day, and so on. And if you look at the Ashkenazi, the Hasidic community today, some of these Hasidic enclaves throughout the United States and the Hasidic in Israel, you will note that they are living as if they are still inhabiting the shtetls of the 17th century in Europe. Their clothing, their language, they speak Yiddish. They speak Hebrew when they pray in the synagogue. They speak Yiddish as the language of the street, as if they were still living in 18th century, 17th, 18th century Europe. Their clothing, the men wear knickers with the white socks and so on and so forth. They still wear a stramel, this hot, heavy fur hat that nobody wears in Israel except the Hasidic. Why? Because it was what they wore in the bitter, freezing cold winters of Poland and Russia and Ukraine and Germany and so on. So, so many of those customs and ethnic and cultural divisions have been maintained in the Hasidic community, whereas the rest of Ashkenaz moved forward with the Enlightenment. And that had a significant impact on all Jews of the time. So I think we're going to stop there because that is a lot of information. And rather than getting into Sephardic Judaism, which is the other predominant stream of Judaism, which represents about 20%, to Ashkenaz about 75%. I'm going to save that for Thursday. And then we're going to begin to look specifically at some of the movements that came out of Ashkenaz, how they developed, specifically what their beliefs are. And when we get to that, which will either be on Thursday or early next week, that's when you got to start taking notes, either physically or mentally. Because you're going to say, Rabbi Leah just talked about Reform Judaism, and I'm not sure I buy into some of the things they're saying. Or I was raised Orthodox. I became conservative as a young adult. I raised my children conservative. But these things I'm being told about conservative Judaism, what their tenets are, is really not part of my belief system. So, I'm not trying to uproot your entire belief system, but I just want to give you some solid information about what these streams of Judaism say they are about. What does conservative Judaism say it is? What is humanistic Judaism? What is Orthodox Judaism? What is Reform Judaism? What is post-denominational? We're going to get into all these different streams. But we'll pick up on Thursday talking about Sephardic Judaism, and then we'll get back to Ashkenaz. Okay? I'm going to wish you lahitraot. Bye-bye for now, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Bye bye.